So, welcome to the last session of the day. We made it. I'm pretty sure I met all of you today, but just in case, my name's Kyle Curlew from Queen's University in Canada. The session today is titled Anonymity, Privacy, and Dataveillance. It'll be a little different from, I guess, the other sessions, which were more so around self-tracking. I guess, and I'm not entirely sure how, but this one's probably more so about being tracked. So we'll start with me with the myth of anonymity, but also with Amy Christmas next with human quantities, aestheticizing dataveillance in contemporary art practice, and Chelsea Palmer with Data Commons Foundation Quantified Self-Report Card. Awesome. Okay, so I'm presenting today on some theoretical musings and empirical observations. Sorry, I have to interrupt myself for a sec. I need the time. Okay. So theoretical musings from my thesis work. I'm not presenting too much of my empirical work, though you can ask about it later. So a lot of this stuff is more just theory. This presentation is titled The Myth of Anonymity. I use this concept to capture various vernacular understandings of what it means to perform anonymity in a cyber world characterized by ubiquitous surveillance. The concept of mythology emerges from the discipline of folklore, an academic practice of studying the everyday lives and narratives of social actors. Along with sociological theory, it is useful for exploring the perspectives of the actors themselves. The traditional usage of mythologies were, as folklorist William Bascom defined, quote, as tales believed as true, usually sacred, set in the distant past or other worlds or parts of the world, and with extra-human, inhuman, or heroic characters, unquote. The classical take on mythology has changed in its usage depending on the discipline or field of study. So a much more accurate definition for my usage of the term comes from sociologist Vincent Moscow. Myths are, quote, stories that animate individuals and societies by providing paths to transcendence that lift people out of the banality of everyday existence. Unquote. He continues, quote, myths are not just a distortion of reality that require debunking, they are a form of reality themselves, unquote. The folklorist Lynn McNeil adds to this, observing that through understanding myths, the social scientist may be able to catch glimpses at deeply rooted systems of belief. I use the concept of a myth to explore anonymity as something considered to be true or given in a world characterized by countless non-human components such as codes, hardware, and algorithms, and routinized digital surveillance. Using the analytical framework of mythology to understand my qualitative findings allowed me to peer into the black box of user perceptions around anonymity, various forms of surveillance, and data doubles. It is important to note that my use of mythology does not represent a form of false consciousness. In fact, as Ms. Moscow asserts, people typically continue to practice a mythology even after it's proven false, or in the case of my research, even though the users believed it to be false all along. What is most striking about the myth of anonymity is that human social actors who practice anonymity understand themselves as anonymous even while existing in a socio-technical context that is underscored by intense surveillance, data surveillance practices. My observations in this presentation come from a qualitative and ethnographic case study that I've developed on a social media platform called Yik Yak, which is more popular in America. I'm not sure, have all of you guys? No, okay. It kind of made overseas a little bit, but not enough, it seems. This research has allowed me to unpack. Yeah, I know. It does that. Okay. Okay. It'll be back in there. Okay, cool. To explore some of the opaque practices, perceptions, and intentions that entail performative, anonymous acts in digital communities. There we go. That's Yik Yak. Yik Yak is an anonymous and hyperlocal, location-based social network that champions a central feed that is regulated by upvotes and downvotes. Users can either post with a handle or a username or anonymously to the feed. They're also able to comment on posts and engage in discussions. Yik Yak was developed by Brooks Buffington, Tyler Droll, and Douglas Warsler, three university fraternity brothers from Furman University in South Carolina. Yik Yak took off with an ambitious speed, populating communities on university campuses across North America. The rapid expansion of Yik Yak's platform was timely. It occurred during a developing hype around anonymous social media, including Whisper and Secret. Within a year of its launch, Yik Yak was able to secure around $75 million in investments from interested companies. These investments became fuel for carrying the platform to the top 10 applications on Apple App Store and Google Play Store. The application platform had once boasted a fully anonymous system. However, for various reasons and over a period of 3 years, the company introduced new features that dismantled its anonymity. This exodus of anonymity peaked on August 16, 2016, when the company introduced mandatory user handles or pseudonyms that made the app fully pseudonymous. Speculation from tech pundits and journalists surmised that Yik Yak's updates away from anonymity were a strategic move to counteract the growing problem of trolling and bullying occurring over its servers. Yik Yak quickly entered a public controversy that began to chip away at the application's popularity and success. The controversy around bullying and harassment online eventually pushed Google to remove the Yik Yak from its top charts. Users could still find and download the app, but they can no longer see it in the lists. The move to update the platform to force users to maintain a handle and a bio opened up an even larger controversy as users rejected the application all out. Social actors who were utilizing Yik Yak's platform for its ability to mediate fully anonymous communication suddenly found themselves in a strange new territory of pseudonyms and handles. The once busy feed of steady anonymous content dissolved and almost its entire user base abandoned the application. In response to the negative reviews and the collapse of its user base, the company eventually made handles optional again to give the choice of anonymity. But by that time, the application had suffered too many losses and was unable to recover. Just a few weeks ago, the company closed and sold everything to another company called Square. In its heyday, Yik Yak was vastly popular at Queen's University, where I conducted the fieldwork, particularly in the undergraduate population. So surveillance in terms of social media can be split into two broad categories that carry significant meaning for its users. First is the hierarchical or institutional surveillance. This can be understood as surveillance conducted by corporate or state bodies for the purposes of policing, social control, and profit. I've noted in my data analysis that participants were largely unconcerned with this form of surveillance. Users typically felt that they weren't individually targeted by Yik Yak, and they generally took the attitude of, quote unquote, I've got nothing to hide. The other type of surveillance is lateral or vernacular surveillance. Andreevich terms lateral surveillance as, quote, not the top-down monitoring of employees by employers, citizens by the state, but rather the peer-to-peer surveillance of spouses, friends, and relatives, unquote. Peer-to-peer surveillance produces its own power effects. It is a disciplinary power that uses vernacular methods of social regulation. This is a key theme in my research, though users were largely apathetic about institutional levels of surveillance. They were chiefly concerned with surveillance conducted by peers. This exposure to a wide range of expectations from friends and family disciplines users to act in normalized ways. This is a key effect noted by Christy Ball in her work on the political economy of interiority, or the surveillance of subjectivities. Users exposed to constant surveillance by their peers leads to a shaping of how individuals are expected to act in the digital world. Anonymity in its purest sense is the masking of identifiable information that can be linked back to a social actor. Just to know, this isn't about the hacking group Anonymous. This is very mundane anonymity in comparison. In much of the literature, anonymity is taken as a spectrum between identifiability and non-identifiability. Such a spectrum is usually associated with the use of digital applications or technical skills in order to mask presence online. Surveillance technologies have become so sophisticated in the contemporary era that it's almost largely impossible to be completely anonymous. With the appropriate resources and time, almost anyone can be found. Gary T. Marks observes, quote, ironically, anonymity is fundamentally social, unquote, as it requires at least one person to perform, one person in an audience to perform. However, framing anonymity as merely a tool tells us very little about its social constitution. Scott and Orlikowski theorize an approach that understands anonymity as a socio-material practice. They observe, quote, how anonymity is enacted depends on the particular ways it is materially instantiated in practice. This includes various social contexts and practices conducted by human actors, as well as technical contexts of the social media platform, codes, and algorithms. These social and technical practices are inseparable. Their agency is entangled. The point is, anonymity, in terms of a performative set of practices, is relative to the socio-material entanglements from within a particular community. In this case, I explored the Queen's University Yak feed for insights on how anonymity is instantiated. This draws together the technical properties of the application, including geolocation data and social and cultural practices of the students at Queen's University. So practices at other universities might actually be significantly different. So when I refer to performativity, I'm referring to Judith Butler's use of the term. This is to say that all human action is performative in the sense that it's stylized repetition of acts in a constant negotiation with power. Human agency allows us to have a choice in our actions, but such choice is bound up in a matrix of power that includes sets of normative actions informed by gender, race, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. For the purposes of my research, I take social action over social media platforms to be just as performative as its corporeal form. Users felt that they were better able to share content and express bracketed performative acts over a social media platform that could not be traced back to their corporeal identity by peers. They also generally expressed that they had no concerns over institutional levels of surveillance, largely because of it had no immediate impacts on their social lives. Social media practice is performative, but it's also mythological, in the sense that it's tied up with fundamental belief systems that shape how users interact on such platforms. One such mythology that users overwhelmingly believed was that when they performed anonymously, they were able to share through content of various forms a slice of an authentic self that could be linked back to could not be linked back to their overall reputation. This is important as it underlies the logics of surveillance capitalism that we will soon explore. If people can translate through performative acts an aspect of their identity to durable social media platforms, then that goes to say that it can be turned into a data double in the form of user profiles that can be created, collated, aggregated, and monetized, a theme that's been popping up quite a lot in these presentations. Sorry for the GIFs if they're giving you a headache. The surveillance scholars Kevin Haggerty and Richard Erickson theorized the surveillance assemblage, a framework that is incredibly useful for the understanding of anonymity in the world of surveillance. They write, quote, this assemblage operates by abstracting human bodies from their territorial settings and separating them into a series of discrete flows. These flows are then reassembled into distinct data doubles, which can be scrutinized and targeted for intervention. Much the same again as most of the presentations that were in the conference so far, except this time more on users that are largely unaware of how these processes work in an anonymous framework. In order to conceptualize Yik Yak as a surveillance assemblage, there are two things I need to explore. First, about in terms of the user base. First, as I mentioned before, users overwhelmingly demonstrated great concern over lateral surveillance and almost complete apathy over hierarchical forms of surveillance. In fact, the main intention for using Yik Yak was that its anonymity allowed them to perform, again, a quote-unquote authentic identity. The viability of authenticity and identity aside, this says a lot. Performative anonymity allowed users to circumvent lateral levels of surveillance due to the socio-technical qualities of the Yak platform, allowing them to perform renditions of their identity that could not be linked back to their overall reputation. Second, according to Yak's terms of service and privacy policy, all interactions are collected and stored on Yak's servers. In terms of the surveillance assemblage, Yak's operators are able to draw together disparate flows of data. Such collision of data streams would inevitably result in consumer profiles called data doubles. The data double would become void of context as it's developed apart from the platform from which it emerged. Metadata, content data, geolocation data, and other sorts of data exhaust produced through anonymous interactions on Yik Yak have the potential to be drawn together to create these data doubles of anonymous human actors and carry the ability to re-identify social actors accurately while exposing the data to massive context collapse, particularly as the company sold the servers. Through this surveillance assemblage, I was able to see the constitution of the myth of anonymity. As far as users are concerned, they are sufficiently anonymous, allowing them to perform novel forms of identity with a reasonable expectation that they aren't being watched. All the while, their data is fed through a largely opaque system of algorithms and servers that are created for largely commercial purposes. When asked if these practices were considered an invasion of their privacy, users admitted that even though the data surveillance was quite invasive, it was a fair trade-off for free use of Yik Yak servers. At the same time, though, users typically had no idea what would actually happen to their data, and there was little speculation about the consequences of big data in general. As Zuboff argued, an entire economy has arisen around digital devices and connectivity that has made business out of big data and the internet. Pioneers in social media capitalism, such as Google and Facebook, constructed an economic schematic that was able to harness data to draw large profits. This allowed capitalist interests to tap into a relatively new form of labor that Lazzarato termed immaterial labor, a term that's popped up earlier. The concept refers to the ways in which labor has been drawn into digital work to produce informational or cultural commodities. Online, every connection, every interaction, all content posted can be translated into data that carry the potential for value. The political economy of social media has been thoroughly discussed and investigated by scholars such as Terranova, Van Dyke, Fuchs, Andreevich, and Zuboff. However, there hasn't been much work done exploring the immaterial labor of anonymous users. Yik Yak had tapped into a novel source of data, the data generated from performative acts under the cloak of anonymity. Their terms of service and privacy policy had been carefully constructed to build the legal scaffolding for such an enterprise. However, for various reasons, the company had never been able to monetize, despite the enthusiastic investments when the app first became popular. There's even a quote that I don't have here of one of the founders saying that they don't even have an intention to monetize. So, and might have led to the company also folding, but Yik Yak eventually collapsed and sold its assets. The politics of big data is a large concern in sociological studies of surveillance. Such practices in science and capitalist enterprise have many political economic repercussions and pose huge privacy issues for the average person. This is incredibly problematic for anonymous social media, as users explicitly act differently when they feel that they're not being watched. And I can imagine that the data looks completely different. Under the myth of anonymity was a generalized apathy of how user data was collected and aggregated. Users generally consent to surveillance practices if they are able to gain access to social media platform of interest. All users, including those who act under the cloak of anonymity, as Coldry observed, quote, are seen as already always data, unquote. This poses significant issues for the politically minded sociologist as long as users remain apathetic to the larger political repercussions of data practices. It'll be very difficult to create change that would benefit users who are largely excluded from opaque corporate practices. After data doubles are constructed, and particularly when their original context becomes destroyed or otherwise inaccessible, what happens to such data doubles? More research of this kind needs to be conducted, but from the perspective of platform operators as opposed to platform users, to get an idea of the textures of surveillance capitalism and anonymity from the corporate perspective. And right on the button of 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for arranging this conference to start with. I mean, this has been really illuminating for me. I came to metric culture through surveillance studies, from science fiction, from just plain old literature studies. So my background's a little bit different. But it's been really good to sort of see all these sort of practice-led research projects. And certainly this lends a lot of context to the issues that I'm researching myself. So what I'm interested in my own research, going back up that very kind of convoluted path to literature, is narrative identities. And through my explorations in surveillance studies, and particularly the way surveillance is represented in the arts, in literature and in visual art, is the way in which there is a kind of tension or a disconnect between narrative identities and or subjective narrative identities and identities constructed externally through metrics, biometrics, and data. So what I want to do today is to talk about 3 art projects which all are kind of unified by the way that they interrogate this relationship between a quantified or metric identity and I guess a more qualitative or subjective form of narrative identity. And using this terminology of narrative identity, I mean, there's quite a lot of literature out there on narrative theories of identity, but I think the simplest one is from the sociologist Anthony Giddens, who puts forward the idea of the self-narrative. Our identities are no more or no less than the ability to keep a story going, a particular coherent story about the self. So this is where I'm starting. 3 projects that I want to look at, and you may have heard of these artists before, and if not, I do suggest that you look them up if art is your thing, because they're quite nice and unique takes, I think, on dataveillance and surveillance environments. And if nothing else, I think, following on from Deborah Lupton's presentation yesterday, they do offer maybe creative ways to visualize data as much as they're offering commentary on the state of ourselves in these types of environments. So the first one is a project called Tracking Transience, which is ongoing since 2002 by a Bangladeshi-American artist called Hassan Elahi, who's also very famous for self-surveillance and sous-surveillance and all of this. The second one is by Heather Juhi Hagberg, who is a biohacker and activist and artist, and her project Stranger Visions is from 2012 to 13. And then chronologically in the middle of these 2, but I've left it till last because I think the work of this final artist, Jill Magid, manages to kind of treat this dialectic that emerges between a metric self and a narrative self. So although she's kind of between the 2 chronologically, I do think kind of in a logical way she's better off finishing up this presentation. So have any of you heard of any of these artists? Yeah? No? Okay. Well, I hope it's not too boring for those of you who already know them. Just in terms of theory for this type of study, and I don't need to go far into depth with this with the surveillance assemblage because we've already just heard it, and I've heard it in many presentations while I've been here. But I think this is a really interesting conceptual tool coming up the arts for someone like me. As useful perhaps now, I think, as things like the Panopticon and, well, from literature, Big Brother, these very sort of like conceptual, metaphorical expressions of how we are disciplined by surveillance and dataveillance and data-driven societies. So, I mean, the main points which Kyle had already mentioned, I'm just going to pick out a few points from Haggerty and Erickson's definition of the assemblage, but the fact that the surveillance assemblage operates by abstracting human bodies in order to create these data doubles. It separates them down into these discrete flows, which can then be scrutinized and targeted for intervention. And I think the one thing that they do identify back in at the turn of the millennium was that groups that were previously exempt from routine surveillance are now increasingly being monitored. And it's not just that they're increasingly being monitored in a passive way, it's that they're actually willfully participating in surveillance practices and dataveillance practices more and more. So just to move to a more recent paper by Jonathan Finn, he creates this term seeing surveillantly. So describing this as being that surveillance is not simply now a technology or apparatus employed in state-sanctioned programs of social control, it's now become a social practice, a way of seeing, understanding and engaging with the world around us. So I think art, because of its hugely sort of emphasis on the visual, has this kind of very privileged position from which to start a discussion about the ways in which we see surveillantly and the way we participate in seeing surveillantly in society today. So the first project I want to talk about is this tracking transience. So and before I kind of do this, I just want to kind of give a nod to Foucault, who I think kind of hovers behind all of us in our theoretical work. And in a way, I just kind of want to gesture to sort of like the dystopian undercurrents that a lot of art and literature arises from when it's trying to represent surveillance. You can look at any dystopian science fiction movie to see the ways in which surveillance and dataveillance is employed to kind of subjugate and control and construct these powers of relations that make it very, very difficult for subjects to claim agency. And it's not to say that these artists that I'm going to talk about go a huge U-turn on this dichotomy and sort of say, well, you know, everything's going to be great. Actually, there's all this positive. They do sort of have this within. And yet they emerge from a reaction to this dystopian undercurrent, which is not only just present, I think, in the arts, but certainly within the theory and surveillance studies as well. Not only Haggerty and Erickson, but also Kirsty Ball and others have identified, you know, more and more leaning towards a worry about surveillance in the world today. So just to kind of give the nod to Foucault, it's only polite. He writes that in Discipline and Punish, he who is subjected to a field of visibility and who knows it, assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection. Earlier than Foucault, and equally as kind of notorious for dealing with the way that institutions discipline our identities, is Althusser when he's writing about ideological state apparatuses. So he writes, and I think this is quite a famous quote as well, that ideology functions in such a way that it recruits or transforms, and he uses the word interpolates, to create subjects from individuals. And this is where I think this project really emerges from. Hassan Elahi, as I said, is Bangladeshi-American, and in 2002, traveling through America in the kind of aftermath of really heightened post-9/11 security, he was stopped, searched, detained, questioned, and then harassed for months and months afterwards. So his response to this was a fairly measured and normal response. He decided to share everything online. So from everything from his receipts to his credit card statements to his bank statements, and to just produce a database of images. So there are tens and tens of thousands of images, and he is still updating this database today. And the premise is that by releasing all of this information into the public domain, he's got nothing to hide, really, right? And so he's performing this kind of transparency as a way to get the kind of institutions off his back. So if you go into Hassan Elahi's website for tracking transience, you're met with quite an innocuous homepage. but you do have this sort of like positioning Google Earth view of where he is. So we can sort of, the very, very zoomed out version, Hassan Elahi is here on the 8th of May this year. And this updates every day. So if you click through, you can get closer and closer and probably see his car. And he updates this regularly, I mean, up to, you know, several times a day. What's quite interesting in his project, aside from the quite overt political dimensions and issues that it raises around privacy and transparency, is a kind of more central question about what happens to the subject when we give over all of this identifying and localizing information. So using these kind of external metrics, global positioning, tracking, in order to kind of identify where this guy is. What happens? Some of the compositions of the images that he uses are kind of thematically grouped. So we get a lot of these sort of like intertitle, they're very much kind of like from the silent film era, where it sort of just like gives you the coordinates of where he is and the name of the town, sometimes just the date. But it sort of functions to create this sense of an ongoing narrative, a kind of a plot. So we can sort of identify where this character was and where he is going and where he will be, and we can follow him on his little journeys around the world. And yet, we never see him in these images. This is quite purposefully done this way. And despite all of this mise-en-scène that he sets up in this series of compositions, from all the food that he has eaten, to the toilets he has used, to the beds he has slept in, there's a lack. There's a lack of subject. 10, okay, thank you. So he's basically just, I thought you were cheering, actually. Way, beds. So the subject has evaporated. He's not there. So despite all this information, despite giving over everything to the institutions, a viable and meaningful subject position has been lost within that. So the next project then, and I hope I'm going to have time to do all of these now. So the next one is with Stranger Visions by Heather Juhi Hagberg. As recently as 2005, Jean-François Bayard writes that there is no such thing as identity, only operational acts of identification, which kind of suggests that this feeling from Foucault and Althusser that our identities are constructed for us, externally given by the institutions or ideologies or socio-discursive systems that we choose to pledge our allegiance to, or choose to pledge our allegiance to, persists in contemporary culture. And you know, in Elahi's project, we see the way that when we allow the institutions to sort of identify us, the identification doesn't really amount to identity. And certainly, I think this is carried over into Juhi Hagberg's work. Moving from kind of external metrics used for tracking and locating an individual to the biometrics of you know, a very kind of unique physiological markers, we might be able to turn to Shoshana Magna, who writes that human beings continually leak biometric information into public space. Biometric discourse thus produces individual bodies as publicly available human inventory. So on top of this kind of, I'm not going to say false dichotomy, but it is, hopefully, if I show this later, this kind of dualism between a metric and a narrative, or an objective and a subjective identity, comes into play this idea of the division between public and private, which is a dualism that surveillance has long troubled. Juhi Hagberg's project was all about collecting samples that she saw humans as shedding all over the place. So she was picking up things like discarded cigarette butts and chewing gum and stray hairs off the subway and nail clippings and things like that. And she was taking this genetic these genetic samples to a DIY biology lab in Brooklyn. And she was extracting genetic information in order to create 3D portraits of the kinds of people who might have been doing the dropping of litter and hair and things like that. And she displayed these things, these masks, I guess, alongside their little display boxes with the particular sample, a bit of information from the genetic code that she'd managed to extract, and also kind of a contextual location of where this particular sample was dropped. She writes, I mean, Heather Juhi Hagberg has quite a dystopian response to genetic dataveillance. She says in a documentary that she's worried about and wants to call attention to the ways in which our DNA could in the future be used against us. In an essay for the New Inquiry, she writes about forensic DNA phenotyping, which is essentially what she's doing, that it has a potential to analyze not only what are considered externally visible characteristics, but also traits like propensities for disease, behavioral characteristics and sexual orientation, intelligence and religion. And she's really, really worried about this. So her overt agenda with this project is actually to not to frighten us, but to draw attention to these quite frightening aspects of genetic dataveillance. What does she manage to produce? I mean, ultimately, when you look at the representations of the faces that she creates, I mean, they're clearly not 100% accurate. She's already suggested in her own writing that these are, you know, likelihoods of the kinds of people based on the information she extracts, what they could look like, what their ancestry might be, their propensity for certain eye colours or skin tones or whatever. But really what's left in these, in a sort of an aesthetic sense, is almost like a death mask. It's, there's not a subject in there. There's a very glassy vision. There's no windows to the soul in those eyes. So like Elahi's project with these vacant beds and, you know, like uneaten meals, I guess, we've got a sense that the subject is really lacking from this data collection. So one thing that I think is interesting about Juhi Hagberg's work, though, is despite the fact that she takes this dim view of genetic dataveillance, she talks about the ways in which we need to understand it anyway, that we need to educate others, devise suitable policies, and to form strategies of resistance, we need to know how this technology breaks. And so she's actually gesturing within that to something actually I think that's far more neutral, or even possibly utopian. Because when she asks who our genetic data might be picked up by and used by, I mean, she is. She's an artist and she's actually creating something fairly beautiful from it. And I think of other ways in which genetic data is becoming more into the public domain, things like these ancestry sites and 23andMe. And there are kind of positives. Juhi Hagberg herself actually published the recipe, as she called it, for doing this project yourself. So if you can access a DIY biology lab, you can do all this. You can go pick up some chewing gum off the streets and find a, you know, make your own death mask. She also talks here about what the phenotyping can allow for, and that it holds the potential to reveal histories that may contradict people's self-understanding and question long-held ethnic and cultural affiliations. Now, within the context of the quote, it's almost like she sees this as a bad thing, but I think there's huge positives within this, in the fact that if our self-understanding can be modified by what we find out from genetic data, that some of the long-held affiliations that we have or the histories that we know help us to modify our sense of self-narrative and maybe occupy a more meaningful position in the world. Certainly if you're finding out new things about yourself, this could have as many positives as negatives. So I think it's a little bit more neutral than she herself suggests. In both of these projects, we're dealing with a sense of the surveillance assemblage intersecting with the socio-discursively constructed subject as theorized by Foucault, Althusser, Bayard, and many others. So what happens in both of their cases is that when identity is seen to be just identification or subjectivity is subjection, the kind of meaningful claim to agency is lost. So the last one, and I'm going to be really quick, the last project that I want to talk about is Jill Maggard's Composite. This artist is phenomenal, I think, in the way that over 20 years she's dealt with systems. These systems are differently interpreted, and she's used a lot of surveillance systems in order to kind of enact her interventions on systemic existence. So she's worked with CCTV companies in the UK, she's worked with the Dutch Secret Service, the NYPD, she's looked at forensics and copywriting and all of these different types of closed systems to which it's really hard to inhabit as an agent, a subjective agent. And her approach for all of these is what she calls seduction. She writes that on her website. She writes, "I seek intimate relationships with impersonal structures and prepare for our seduction. To be seduced is to challenge the other to be seduced in return. Seduction is an engagement, neither representation nor interpretation. It is a cycle to be played back and forth against an end. Once seduced, a system moves from an exercise of power to a form of exchange." In Composite, she decided to kind of infiltrate the forensics procedure for identifying subjects. So a different type of subject, but a subject nonetheless. So she wrote to 21 men that she'd known intimately and asked them to write a detailed description of her face, explaining that then later to 21 different forensic artists that a woman was absent. So the artists ended up with the letters from these guys, and 21 pictures of her were produced by individual forensic artists, which were later displayed. And you can see the artist's real face over here. I think what's quite nice about this project is that none of these pictures are actually her, and yet they all are. The fact that this woman is kind of, she is, the project's called Composite, but the way that these pictures all add up, all of them are true. None of them are fully her, but all of them create this sense of palimpsestual or overlapping in which the subject is sort of built up. And she does this by existing in different people's experiences and different people's stories. And because her kind of image arises from textual description as well, this lends itself quite neatly to thinking about the multiplicity of a narrative identity. I'm almost there. I'll skip reading over this one. So I think where this project diverges from Elahi and Juhi Hagberg's project is it tries to reinstate a subject, and this is kind of the ethos behind Magid's work anyway, is that she's trying to reinstate the subject in institutional or ideological or discursive systems that are kind of quite damning to claiming subjective agency anyway. And in order to do this, she appropriates the methods of the systems themselves. So rather than try and sort of resist them by going against them, she resists by working with, appropriating them and using those techniques in order to kind of gain access. So what happens in this project is that her narrative sense of self is kind of given over in the same way that our identity is given over in surveillance society to the institutions or systems that create it for us. She does the same thing. But she's drawing attention to the fact that our narrative identities are, in huge part, probably more so than the story we tell ourselves, is the way that we exist in the stories of other people. So these stories become kind of multi-layered, and we do give over a sense of ourselves, and we do exist in areas of overlap. So this stops the metric versus the narrative sense of self from becoming kind of hopelessly dichotomous, I think. And it sort of illustrates what Juhi Hagberg was saying, that artists and the general public need to find ways to break these systems. So this is what I feel that these artists all help to do, is to push us to think about where the subject can be located in ideological, institutional, or socio-discursive systems, but also draw attention to the fact that if we start to work with them, we can reinstate a sense of self where surveillance and dataveillance might be stripping us of that sense. The end.
I am no graphic designer, so this is pretty much straight text. I am the acting executive director of the Human Data Commons Foundation in Vancouver, BC. Pretty young nonprofit, incorporated about a year ago, and we have 3 goals, one being to advocate for user rights in the age of big data tracking, biometrics, and everything discussed here, which within the QS community, okay, we understand what quantified self-data means. Within the rest of the world, it's something it's snuck up on people, the GPS tracking, the Fitbits, etc. So it's something that we try to kind of socialize these ideas of, okay, what are the advances being made in tracking every element of our lived experience, rather than there are lots of existing advocacy efforts for the data we enter willingly in Google, et cetera. So we kind of, when we were designing this report card project, we kind of based it on the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Who's Got Your Back report card, which has been going a number of years. And they pretty much cover all of the big players who collect user-submitted data. We also are very, very, very enthusiastic about seeing what paths can be built for these huge reserves of data that are currently almost all siloed by corporations to be provided for academic and nonprofit research. Because as it stands, and I know we have a lot of academics present at the conference, it's just fighting tooth and nail and red tape to really get ethical approval to go seek out or collect new data if all of this existing data is accessible for researchers to run with, and especially data sets that include so many overlapping factors. Then we can do, like one of my big heroes is Sandy Pentland at MIT. He does self-contained worlds, essentially, where he'll set up within a community giving out tracking smartphones to every member and track the weather and stuff like that, traffic patterns, and take all of that data together, put some machine learning going on it, and you start to find out things, rather than coming from presupposed human hypotheses, you allow machines to take ridiculously comprehensive data and say, hey, here's some patterns we wouldn't have even thought to hypothesize. And then finally, and this is why this is the first time in like a year I've spoken anywhere on anything besides blockchain technology, because that's it's our third passion and something that I do think will be really, really good for the quantified self-data industry in terms of secure storage. But yeah, so we look towards how blockchain verifiability can help with these ethical issues around data storage. So the report card was conceptualized last October, and as a speaker in the session before this mentioned, as the abstract for this was written about 7 months ago, totally different than what we thought the project would be. So we did stay with the structure, which was reviewing companies' user-facing privacy practices. And essentially, really what we ended up looking at was when you go to a website for a quantified self company, what do you see? How do you find their documents? How accessible are their documents? What is disclosed? What do you have to go looking for? And what, even if you go looking for it, isn't there at all? And yeah, so again, with all of us being studying in the quantified self field, you're probably all very aware that issues of privacy become even more important when it's a set it and forget it sort of thing. And when I pull up, Google, I'm always somewhat aware, oh wait, do I want to search this in private mode? Like, could this be misinterpreted? Is this weird? But when you have constant, ubiquitous tracking of your movement, etc., it's really easy to forget. If you don't have the like ping me when I'm not moving Fitbit, like it's easy to just forget that this is constantly streaming and constantly on. So yeah, we originally wanted to do a totalizing survey of the actual security practices, etc., of these more than 50 companies. And it's myself, our board chair, and a consulting researcher. So that didn't happen, and primarily because in order to do that, we would have had to reach out to these companies and ask them to give us their information internally. So we focused in this year, this is going to be an annual thing, so for this first year we focused on what do they disclose to the user. So it was myself and our consulting researcher Rochelle Fairfield. I designed, there were a couple of iterations of it, I designed an evaluation form with about 20 questions for us to go through each of these companies separately and give our input. I tailored hers to be a bit more user-facing, and mine, since I'm a computer geek, was a bit more like, okay, go and try to find the answers that you can't find upon immediate read. And all of the research forms, the raw data, everything related to this is available as appendices within the report card. And what happened as we moved through it, we realized that you can't really compare Fitbit to MyFitnessPal. Like you can't, like we broke it down into devices that actually collect, the manufacturers of the collection devices, user platforms that do take self-contributed user data, middleware analytics. A lot of the companies we pulled up as we were looking at them, we realized this isn't user-facing at all. But still, let's see what they're saying about user-facing practices. And then the conglomerates, because you really can't compare a Google to anything but a Google, Google, Samsung, et cetera. Like, we called conglomerates any company that had existed and was well established in the tech industry before entering the quantified self market. And the biggest chunk of this report card, and the thing that took up just I think like 80 hours of my life, was I went through and made a tailored summary of mine and Rochelle's evaluation of each of the companies, and this is available as an appendix, just hitting every single point in the hopes that we can reach out this summer, provide those to these companies and say, okay, first of all, are we correct? Are we missing something? Second of all, here's our recommendations for you to do better, and hey, maybe you'll get a better score. So yeah, sort of that influencing. Now this is just up here, you can't really probably read it, but the color coding is main important thing. So I established kind of little segments here for best practices down to missing completely. And the criteria for this, for the ratings, is pretty objective. I tried to veer towards objective. So is there a fixed link on every page for the privacy policy? That's pretty standardly necessary in most countries. In Canada, where we're based, it's also necessary to have a dedicated privacy contact. And in this case, just because it is somewhat of a rarity with many American-based companies, we counted email privacy at. But ideally, it should be a named privacy officer, indicating how future changes will be communicated. And we didn't go into the relative ethical strength of that. Most of the time, changes will be indicated here, so keep coming back and checking. And the most qualitative of these was an attempt made, the researchers feel an attempt was made to create a readable policy? And primarily a summary at the beginning, or one of the best practices I saw was kind of like when you'll look at a translated book and there will be a sidebar with your language and then the original text. A couple of companies did that where they would have the legalese of terms and conditions and then like a sentence every once in a while, like this means we can take your GPS information. And then are there ways to contact a human being? So I will just zoom through the 4 categories now that you know that. Oh, and there's extra credit points for things that are still kind of, you shouldn't get docked a point for them, but things like disclosing specific security standards, disclosing whether there's an open API available for developers, et cetera. So in the device manufacturing category, we had pretty strong user-facing like interface sorts of stuff in terms of you can find the documents. We tell you how future changes will be indicated, and really surprisingly readable policies. And again, that varies and is subjective, but out of the 4 categories, really high up there in attempting to use human readable language. The user platforms for either self-submitted data or that took and aggregated data from device manufacturers, all of them had a policy link, yes. And most of them indicated their future changes, et cetera. They were pretty strong on being able to contact a human being. Really, the policies that weren't readable were really unreadable. And there were actually a couple of language barriers, which were interesting, and like links within English documents to non-English documents. So it's kind of a fun adventure with those. And the middleware analytics, almost no privacy contacts. That was the main thing. But again, we kind of had a struggle with this because they're not necessarily user-facing. Great for points of direct contact for sales of their technology to companies. So, this was something that we kind of, I'll describe in the conclusion, sort of our navigation around, well, how do we judge these specific things? And then the conglomerates, great on giving information. And most conglomerate organizations, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, have entire privacy portals. They have explanations and educational resources on, what is HTTPS? So, how should things be stored on servers, et cetera. Almost none of them had any way to contact a human being, including email or submission form. And the ones that did, a lot of them you had to click through like 10 pages of FAQs, like this is about this product, et cetera. So if you just have a general inquiry, you're out of luck. So yeah, we originally wanted one of the criteria to be one of our main goals, which is an evaluation of contribution for social good research. There are 2 companies out of more than 50 that have any such work, which is Apple's Health Kit and the menstrual tracker app Clue. It was shocking. We had like a rating category, and it was like, well, we don't even need this on the table because we can just state to exist. Also, across all of them, it was difficult to figure out whether they were talking about accessing their website. These are the terms of us, that we use cookies, etc., or whether it was about their actual services and products. And this was particularly problematic with the conglomerate companies. Like, they would have this huge privacy portal with all these resources and absolutely nothing specific. And particularly with QS devices, it's really important that this sort of documentation indicates what happens with the GPS information, etc. And yeah, it's difficult to talk about how and when the user should be notified, because best practices conceptually in a laboratory would be you are notified directly by email every time there is a change. But that would be really annoying, and even the notifications I get personally, I'll kind of glance and be like, oh, I have 40 other emails. So there needs to be an industry conversation around what material changes means, like what the user should be notified about, and how that will, not kind of just glaze over. Oh, I lost part of my text there. Well, we'll just, we need a new world in many ways. We'll just stick with that. So many ways. Yeah, a new world in which. So reflections on this. We did this all by ourselves, and I did all the design and data analysis and stuff. And one of the things I wrote in the report is I never, ever, ever want to do this again by myself. It was exhausting. But the machine learning that's used in, like, the textual analysis tools and stuff like that that's used in a lot of these cases, like, that's the primary tool for privacy policy analysis. It's missing the nuance of, as exhausting as this was, I would check mine and Rochelle's results and be like, wait a minute, though. I'm not sure, I'm not just going to take the median between what we said. I'm going to revisit and talk to her and revisit the document and see what it is we are missing. And that's why this ridiculously long appendix addresses those sorts of, gray areas of it was interesting that our opinions conflicted on this specific thing. And as I said earlier, we're gonna reach out to these companies and kind of try to, use buddy-buddy tactics to encourage them to catch up to their peers in various ways. Because ultimately, except for a couple of brand new companies, some of which are kind of like in pre-launch stage, so it's understandable, every single company did something good and something bad. And so one of the biggest recommendations I'm going to be trying to push with these conglomerates is, hey, you've got this really nice privacy portal that explains everything. Why don't you open source it and let all these other companies link to it? Because it's understandable that a brand new startup is not going to design a privacy portal. So yeah, the idea of kind of sharing as best practices, because when it comes to this isn't, industry secrets or algorithms. It hurts no one for there to be field collaboration in this regard. And yeah, for our 2018 report card, we intended to have crowd-sourced participation in this. We found out it's really hard to get the crowd to do anything. I mean, I think we all kind of know that these days. We did have crowd participation in shaping the focus for this. We had a couple of discussion sessions at a hackerspace I co-run called Decontrol in Vancouver, which is hackerspaces will be very, very privacy suspicious, so we had some guidance from the crowd on where to go with this, but ideally we're going to crowdsource review of the websites. And we are in the process of designing a standard template for companies to use human-readable language at the beginning of their privacy policy. Kind of like with Creative Commons, you can go to their website and be like, yes, you can use my information commercially. yes, you have to credit me, etc. So we're putting together a very brief sort of plug in your answers here, standardized sort of summary for the beginning of privacy templates. And yet trying to get that data to research for social good. I was really honestly shocked. I could not believe how few companies were even discussing something like this. So yeah, and I want to use, I think I got a minute left. I do want to, oh, I have 3 minutes left. Awesome, okay. I want to use this opportunity, go renegade a bit, because it has been like 8 months since we submitted this, and particularly the 2 awesome presentations before mine really make me want to bring up blockchain because that is a huge focus of the foundation. And blockchain, most people have heard of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is considered blockchain's killer app. It was the first implementation of the blockchain protocol that has succeeded wildly. Anyone who got in on the ground floor is basically a millionaire now. Some of them are billionaires. I'm not one, but good on them. But yeah, blockchain protocols solve some of these problems of surveillance being beyond the user's control that come up. Essentially, blockchain databases would allow us all to peer review one another's activity and the storage of data, confirm through not human consensus, but computer consensus, that the state of a network at any given point is what one player claims it is. And the reason it's excellent for the concerns around surveillance is that blockchain tech as a core is pseudonymous. It can be fully anonymous if you're real careful. You can jump around, keep abandoning wallets or nodes or whatnot, and maintain complete anonymity. But for all users, it would be pseudonymous. Yes, pseudonymous. And what's crucial for that with this step towards research for social good is by de-identifying data from the user from the very outset, we could have databases which you wouldn't just get permission to access as an individual researcher or an institution, but which everyone could play with this data. And I mean, MIT has released a lot of really cool data analysis tools publicly, so just imagine that we could all do our own experiments on de-identified data sets that have like massive global reach. So that's my off-topic plug since I had some time. Yep.
All right, any questions? Is that pen hand up? No.
It is? It's a hand, but...
Okay, so...
Yeah, sure. Okay, so mine is the kind of the... So at which point is a quantitative difference a qualitative difference kind of question? So Kyle's presentation made me think of it, so it's sort of phrased toward him, but I think you can react as you want to. So it's basically, so you're sort of engaging with sort of behavioral phenomena, how people act while being watched in different contexts. I mean, that's basically, psychology. And I suppose like some of the things that you're talking about will be, relevant in any kind of society. So, but you focus on sort of digital media or a specific app. So is that basically because you find that a site, like a specifically rewarding site for observing a general human behavioral phenomena? Or is it because you think that something genuinely new or qualitatively different is going on with social media?
Kind of a bit of both. First is like it's a methodological choice in terms of the theories that I was using. I started off with inspiration from actor network theory, material semiotics, which is about trying to do deep empirical exploration, and the idea that one community will be very different from another. So the idea that of the socio-material entanglement, that people interacting with Yik Yak at Queen's University create a specific set of communities. So my research isn't very generalizable, although there were some theoretical observations that came from it. The second part is in terms of... what was the other part of the question?
Well, I think there was just one part, basically, whether, are you interested in sort of human behavior? In
Oh, the
specific
novel.
situ-
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I got it. The novel form of human behavior that I was interested in, which wasn't. I mean, people have been acting anonymously online forever. Is just that what Yik Yak provided as a platform was a mediator that allowed, in the beginning, when everything was fully anonymous, for people to communicate. So the content would be shared in this single feed with no names or identifiers attached. And then people would regulate it through upvotes and downvotes. So aside from like 4chan, which was, I guess, quite a lot bigger in scope, like the kind of novel performativity wouldn't be possible in other platforms. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it was just
So
input for reflection more than a specific question. I think that could be answered yes or no. So.
okay.
Yes, actually, I have one question for each. They're not very big, I think. But to begin with, is in this last art project with the DNA, isn't there an ethical? Does she discuss the ethical side of that? If someone comes in and sees, oh, that must be me, I actually move around in that area, chewing gums.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it could happen.
Yeah, no, sure. She gave a TED talk actually about, and at the beginning, her first question was, "Is this legal?" But I think it does raise quite interesting questions. I mean, like we do just like shed all of this information all of the time. I mean, like all of those glasses from lunch
But
will
it's
have
only information if we bring it forth. If you send it to laboratory.
True. Well, true. Yeah, I guess so. But
It's still an ethical.
yeah, no, of course. And
action is involved.
sure. And I suppose this is kind of again like where these artists have a role in kind of like dramatizing something to the point where it pushes issues like that to the fore. It's not that these issues aren't being discussed, it's just that sometimes it almost needs like this kind of extrapolation, this kind of dramatization for it to make enough of an impact.
Yeah, sure. My problem is not that I think it was unethical.
Yeah.
My question was rather if she discussed the ethical side of it. Because
yeah.
it's an interesting, more general question.
It's true. I mean, from my knowledge, she hasn't really gone into that much depth about it. I think she kind of very sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of nods her head to the fact that this is probably not that ethical. However, I think she's almost because she professes to be so worried about the way that this DNA could be used or whose hands it could get into. Almost by being the person whose hands it got into, she's sort of saying, well, you know, it could happen. It could be someone that could do much worse than I'm doing with your DNA. So I mean, there is that element to it. But you're right. I mean, it's a completely woolly area, and I guess not many of us think about it when we leave fingerprints and spit and stuff everywhere. So I don't know.
May I just add, she in different contexts, I've heard her speak several times. She's often asked this question, and she kind of claims to make it part of her art that's the performance to a certain degree, whether or not. And she takes kind of artistic license as an artist. She kind of has to say, I have a license to do that. But I think she plays with this boundary intentionally.
Yes. Yeah. No, it makes it more interesting, I think, if she does it that way. Yes. Can I continue? I was thinking, you used the phrase objective a lot in different contexts in your talk. You
Referring to the yes/no questions?
You refer to it both in relation to this big data, and you don't have a subjective question, you let the data kind of form its own. And you used objective, and at least you used subjective in relation to that. You used objective also in relation to your own collection of this. So maybe
I shouldn't have tried to see. I've been hanging out with hackers too much. I'm not used to being around critical theorists anymore. well caught. No, it's interesting. I feel that I often have to argue on behalf of subjectivity and qualitative perspectives and stuff like that in the communities I run in, which are very much binary 1-0 sorts of things. So that's a very good point. I'm gonna keep an eye out on myself for that, because I'm kind of constantly trying to be like, oh, and we have this objective, sort of validity there. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Because also in relation to big data, etc., it's not objective in the means that this is reality. It's something created, right?
Yeah,
it's
very
a
true.
new body.
Yeah,
it's something new. It's not reality. And I think people within this should totally emphasize that and
Yeah.
embrace that we are creating something
Yeah.
here. And that makes the whole objective-subjective dimension, it twists it
Yeah.
at least, right?
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
then it's not about reality, subjective.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, the last question.
Just before though, I just want to get a sense of who else has
Yes,
questions
yes,
in the room.
please.
Okay, so we have
Go
two more
ahead,
questions. We do have 13 more minutes, so you can ask your.
Or you?
No, go ahead.
No, because to you, I started to think about anonymity in a more historical perspective, and it made me think: how long has it been important to be anonymous, and also in relation to what is it important? Is it in relation to capitalism? Is it in relation to? I mean, in a small-scale society, there was no such thing. It was not an issue. So, have you thought about this?
I mean,
in a more large historical.
Not particularly, but in generally. I think historically, I think anywhere the anonymity depends on context. For an example, a lot of people back before computer era were talking about anonymity in a crowd, in a metropolis. But then again, like where I'm from in Newfoundland, in small communities, you have a practice called mummering, where every Christmas people put on masks and go knocking door to door for alcohol and carols. Yeah, so but everyone's anonymous except for the host. So yeah. So anonymity does appear in several different contexts throughout history, but I think in terms of the digital era, there might even be a difference between, like, I had the Mask of Anonymous, the hacking group, which is very different from the anonymity of Yik Yak, which is much more mundane and about particular sharing of content, where political anonymity for privacy reasons would probably also entail much more skill in terms of understanding the technical aspects of anonymity. So yeah, I think it depends on where.
Yeah, and is this anonymity in face of this that actually my reader, so to say, the one who sees me, are anonymous?
Yeah.
That I don't know who they are.
You don't know.
Is that the triggering point? That then I also need to be anonymous?
Yeah. Well, so sorry.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this anonymity, then why it's actually needed.
Oh, okay. So the user intentions, which is actually the main part of my research, which I didn't cover in the presentation, there were several different themes that popped up, from entertainment to mental health issues to wanting to be a therapist for those in the network who are talking about mental health issues, to trolling. There were some terrible people online as well, but there's this pretty big diverse ecosystem of intentions for wanting to be anonymous. And they were directly, in my opinion, linked to that anonymity, because once the anonymity was taken away and the network became pseudonymous, so I'm just taking the time, the users left. There was no more need to use the application. It was no different than Reddit. So the anonymity is what kept people using it. So I think you can kind of see this qualitative understanding of purposeful anonymity. Does that?
Yes.
Can I real quick tag onto that? Because I did kind of our executive summary, I did a historical sort of conception around this. It seems all the legal arguments around anonymity have arisen at every stage of advances of technology. So the printing press, photography, etc. And it seems that, at least in a general way, historically, two of the main impulses there have been, okay, well, with this documentation of the self, I can't control the narrative, and that documentation cannot be destroyed. So it seems like that's the thing. And then you've got the technologies where it's I don't really get Snapchat and stuff, but the idea that this will disappear. So that's some form of anonymity as well.
Yes.
At least on one level.
Yeah. Screenshot.
Who was first? Sorry.
You were first.
Okay. So my question is for Chelsea, actually. So I find it always interesting how tech companies are on the one side very encouraging people to be sharing and open, and then when it comes to their own practices, they're often very obscure. So we are actually planning on doing something similar, but for sharing economy companies or platforms, so looking at their privacy policies in terms of services and so on. And my question was, with your experience, kind of when it comes to the outreach thing, going back to the companies, maybe talking with them, what's your experience? How do they react?
Well, it's the same as the findings we had in terms of providing direct points of contact. The smaller a company is, the more thrilled they are to hear from you. So, and it is really, really difficult to get through to those bigger players. But in general, I mean, what we are framing it as is the you catch more flies with honey. So approaching them with, you did great in these ways, oh, let's chat. And also, by the way, do you think you could do this? But yeah, there's always inevitably, whether it's with companies or individuals, going to be just dead silence on some fronts. But the attempts at outreach, I'm interested in maybe talking later about what you're working on.
Thank you.
I think she was first.
Okay, all right. We'll just do a big line down.
No, I was just wondering in your research with the users, you were talking about lateral privacy. I don't know if this came up in this particular context, but just even like a rudimentary example. If I search for a gift, let's say, for my partner, and I don't want him to know about it, but because the advertising algorithms function the way they do these days, inevitably it'll come up. Whatever content of my search or my particular interaction I have had will come up on some kind of feed where, I was researching, a watch or something.
Yeah, especially if you like it.
Was that, and I don't remember if you said that whether or not Geek was trying to monetize the conversations as a kind of data they were selling in the back end. Did that come up kind of unexpectedly in people's feeds? The topics that they were discussing would emerge as solicitations for different things that they could purchase.
Never.
In the context of.
Yik Yak was a really strange company in terms of its political economy, like incredibly strange. I think they were hoping to get bought up by Facebook or Google or one of the larger social media firms. But in terms of their plans for monetizing, as I said in the presentation in one interview, with one of the founders, he said that they're not even looking at monetizing yet, which was a year before they collapsed. They did, though, set up a whole scaffolding in their terms of service and privacy policy. So there was every which way they could think of, they allowed or put into their policies so that they could set it up. It's just that they never did it. There were no advertisements. I'm not sure, and this is where I contacted the Yik Yak several times through too many different means, and they ignored me every time. So probably having insight on their ideas of how to even monetize anonymous data. Maybe it was a couple presentations ago, I think it was Thomas said that a lot of data that people collect or companies collect ends up being completely useless. They're unable to attain value, and that the idea of value in data is much larger than the actual practical value. So no, there was no advertisements, there's no linking things together. It was kind of like a moving disaster for the last 2 years.
Was it actually anonymized on their back end? When
No.
the person registered would have to enter any kind of identified information, so it's not truly.
It was registered to the App Store, and you had to enter your phone number, and then it had access to all your location data and your albums, and so yes, they have quite a lot of access to the data on your phones and the data your content data that you add. I just don't know how it was used after, or I think much more concerning is who bought it after, or where did the servers go onto the company Square after? Are they going to use it for something?
It was bought out?
A couple months ago, 60% of their employees got fired, and then a couple weeks ago, I think about a month ago, they sold the company and shut the servers down, so the app no longer exists.
Yeah, got a question for Amy. I really felt very inspired by your 3 artists and your analysis of them, so thank you for that. And what I was understanding from it was the importance of people understanding what's going on, how these systems are working, and then the artist's ability to get into those systems, their kind of institutional capture where they took over the systems themselves. turned it into something else, and then persuaded the institution to think about how they were constructing the subject. I work in universities, and those three examples were all more about institutions that are controlling the public. I was wondering if there's any examples from art where artists are looking at how organisations control their employees, because that's a slightly different set of relationships, and I'm interested in what I call coercive accountability within universities, where you have to give information that is then used to control you.
Right.
And the limits on that, and where we can find room for manoeuvre to turn it into something else. So I was trying to relate what your artists were doing in that more public space of the state institutions and the public to public or commercial organisations where there's an employer-employee relationship, and that kind of surveillance data is used to manage a workforce.
Okay, so I don't know if it's quite what you're after, but this third artist, Jill Maggard, in 2004 she was living in Amsterdam, and she ended up working for the Dutch Secret Service. She was employed by them to create a human face for the company. So she did this through interviewing people that worked there, and she basically has these spy files that she was writing. And the idea was at the end of it, she was going to kind of like present this back to the company. So she wrote it all up and gave it to them, and they redacted it all and wouldn't give it her back. So she kind of negotiated one-time exhibition of this work. So you can buy copies of this novel. I guess the novel's called Becoming Tardan. And it's and so there's kind of like you can buy it from her gallery, or maybe find a copy online. You can buy the redacted version, so there's not much in there, and then the actual book it was exhibited for one, I think, at the Tate Modern, and at the end of the exhibition period, the Dutch Secret Service came and got it and took it back. So
that's a fantastic story.
Yeah, I mean, her stuff's amazing. I really felt like I was rushing the end of this, because actually out of the three, she's my favourite, and I just adore the work she does, because it's really all about inhabiting systems, but it's not just a lot of it is public institutions. So then she does things with things like copyright and looking at the way like this creates a system and this creates subjects. But I mean, I think if you're looking for something that's more to do with I mean, it's a very private sort of sector, but I mean, spies and...
Okay, but I mean, I think the thing perhaps we need in universities is that sense of humour also. The kind of artistic imagination, which isn't just being clever artistically, but also making fun of some of the nastiness that's going on to expose it.
Oh, for sure, yeah. No,
and, I think that's missing in the universities somewhere. We've got very serious about the way that we don't understand the way that we're managed to start with, and we too seriously kind of being trained as in a truth machine. We actually truthfully give the material that we're asked for. I think we should do something much more like send them all our pictures of food or something instead of our publications or something like that. And we need to do something different. It's inspired me to think, okay, well, we've got to just kind of play with the criteria that are being used to manage us, to just turn it into something completely crazy.
Yeah, and I do think as well, they kind of, these artists sort of have this role of kind of grabbing attention for people who aren't considering these kinds of questions to consider these kinds of questions. I mean, this is certainly how I was pulled into looking at surveillance studies. So it's I think you're right. It's I hope you can find what you need from her work.
That's great.
She's wonderful.
Just to interrupt, we are now out of time, but we do have one more question if you really need to go.
It's okay, I can catch up with the speakers later.
I mean, it's the last session, so there's nothing after this, so if you want to ask the question, you're more than welcome.
Okay, so my question or really comment was for Chelsea. I really think what you're doing is very, very important work. And my background is not from sort of metric or media studies. I'm a development geographer, largely working in the global south. And I just wondered if you had thought about sort of your outreach work in terms of education about privacy and what the companies are doing, in a sort of development context for, so there was this big scandal in India where, Facebook came and saying, oh, we'll provide free internet to villagers, but it was only going to be Facebook, a billion consumers. And, it seems very patronizing sitting here to say, oh, these people need to be educated. But I think a lot of us need to be educated in how our data is captured and what's done. And I really sympathize and understand your approach to go to the companies. They have the resources, the money, and the responsibility to make this, easily accessible and understood. But maybe there's the other way as well of, educating the public, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and for me, that's personally probably one of my biggest passions. And I feel that the Global South actually presents opportunities to do things right. We kind of had the internet creep up on us, and we've made all sorts of mistakes in its development. The next million to billion who are being onboarded to the internet, we now can see ways in which that can be done in a super ethical way. And I mean, there's the concept, my heart is drawn to the concept of Jihad, which is like the Urdu word for like frugal hack innovation, and the Global South is driven by Jihad. And I mean, again, I'm like from hacker communities, it's very much the idea of MacGyver, solve a problem with the resources you have at hand, and usually you're going to be a lot more innovative than if you're in a room in Silicon Valley with $10 million of like when you start with the money and then are like, what do we make? That's not usually very innovative. But yeah, no, so I believe the Global South is actually, to me, it's a radical statement, but I believe it will be our saving in technology. So definitely a good point.
All right, folks, we're gonna have to end it there. Was that a question or was that a...
Yeah, comment, very quick.
Okay, yeah.
Chelsea, you are planning to give us symbols like, for instance, in Creative Commons, right?
Yes.
So, little orange arrows, and this is a good data storage company. This is they are going to share the good data and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's especially important in the mobile app world we're immersed in, because you get a quick glimpse of something and then you're accepting the conditions. There's been actually some very good research and design going into that, and we're hoping to reach out to the people who have designed these sort of preliminary frameworks for what that could look like and roll with that. Because yeah, it's the same as we've had it as long as we've had washing machines, the international symbols for things. You get used to it. It's something that you're not going to just click past necessarily. You'll be like, oh, okay, at least I understand this information. Whether I utilize it or not is up to me. But yeah, that's very, very important.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.